Hello everyone, I'm Carolina. Welcome to today's tutorial. Today we're going to be making the Lucy skirt that you can see here behind me. We're going to make the overlap go on this side instead, though. So this is a prototype, not a reference. And you can find the pattern for this style on my website, studiocarolinashear.com. I'm also going to link it down below in the description for you. I'm going to be making my Lucy skirt out of this tartan today. It's the same fabric as this, just in a different color. It's a polyester viscose blend. And you're also going to be needing some buttons. You're going to be needing 2 buttons for the outside and 2 on the inside. And on the outside, I'm going to be using 20mm diameter buttons, and on the inside, 17mm diameter buttons. But the size is completely up to you. It's not written or specified in the pattern because it doesn't really matter. It's more of a creative decision that you can take. So that's what I'm using, but you use whatever buttons you want. And the reason I'm using 2 different ones is because I think that these are too nice to use on the inside of the skirt. So I just took a more basic button on the inside. For the pattern, you have 2 fronts, and so you have one front that is slightly longer than the other one, and that is the outside front. And it's also specified on the pattern. So you have all the information that you need written on the pattern. And you have, here it's written on the side, or on the edge that is not connected to the sideline, on the other edge. It's written 2 cm seam allowance, and on the hem it's also written 2 cm seam allowance, and that is the minimum seam allowance that you want to add. So if you add 2 cm, you're going to have on the inside you're going to have a overlocked or zigzag edge, so kind of a raw edge in a sense. I'm going to be adding 4 cm seam allowance here and on the bottom, and then doing a double folded hem to hide my edge. And you can do that if you want, or you can do a 2 cm one. It's completely up to you. I'm doing 4 cm because I don't like when you see like the raw edge on the inside, but it doesn't really matter. So either you do 4 cm like I'm doing in the video, or you do 2 cm, and either way it's gonna be fine. For the facing, you want to add 1 cm of seam allowance on the upper edge and on the sideline, and no seam allowance on the bottom. So that's the back facing, and on the front facing it's the same thing. No seam allowance on the bottom, and on the front facing you also don't want to add any seam allowance on the front side or the front edge. This is the sideline, there you want 1 cm, and on the front edge, no seam allowance. But all of that is written in the pattern, so don't panic, it's gonna be fine. The pieces that you'll be needing for this skirt is 1 left front, 1 right front, 1 back cut and fold, and then 2 front facings and 1 back facing. That is it. This is a very easy skirt to make. It's not very time consuming. It also doesn't take a lot of fabric, so only positives. Let's get started. I have my pieces cut and I am ready to start sewing. I will start with sewing my darts on the skirt, and then I'll do my overlocking and zigzagging. No, I'm sorry. I will do the overlocking and zigzagging. So I have put a pin here to mark where my dart ends, because my fabric is dark, so it's kind of difficult to do any markings on it. But I mean, I will try. So this, where the pin is where the actual dart ends on the pattern. But when I sew darts, I like to stop sewing my dart just like 5 mm above that point, and then kind of curve it off a little bit. And I do that because it creates less pointy darts. So, you know, sometimes when you're sewing, you have like really just pointy darts sticking right out, and it's not so attractive. So by doing this, I'll show you how to do it. It creates a softer, a more harmonious dart. So I'll just pin my darts together, and I have 1 cm seam allowance here. And what I'll do is I'll sew my dart so to around here, and then here I will curve it off and sew just right next to the edge of my fabric. And then I'll go off my fabric and continue sewing for 2 cm, which is going to make my threads intertwine and allowing me to lock them in place without doing a backstitch at the point of the dart, because if you do a backstitch there, it's gonna get bulky, and we don't want that. We don't want a bulky dart. So I'm just going to continue after I finish my dart, intertwining my threads to lock them in place. And the only place where I'll do a backstitch is at the top here. So what I'll do now is I'll try to draw in this dart with my white marker here. I'm not sure if it's gonna work. Okay, that does absolutely nothing. I'll just wing it. And there you go. So I've ended my dart slightly above where my peak point is, or my dart point, end point. And then I've just trailed it off and intertwined my threads at the bottom. Now I'm just going to do my other darts and then iron them all flat. When you're ironing your dart, you want to iron the seam allowance towards the side seam. After ironing, I will overlock and zigzag all the edges that I need to overlock and zigzag. So the bottom of the facing, and then the side seams, or the side lines, the side edges, on all your skirt pieces, the seam allowance of your darts. So I'll do that now. And I'm also just going to put a little pin here so that I know that this is my front edge. Like, it is visible, but sometimes when you're sewing, or I don't know about you, but when I'm sewing, I just don't see the obvious when I'm like so into something. So I'll just put a little pin there to mark that this is my front. And I'm not, like, you can mark your button positions now. I'm not gonna do it because my fabric is just so dark and it's impossible to mark on it. So I'll do that later. Also, if you are sewing your skirt with 2 centimeter seam allowance on the edge, the front edge and the hem, you want to zigzag and overlock those as well. I'm not doing it now because I have 4 centimeter seam allowance and I'll do a double folded hem. But if you're just doing one single folded hem, you definitely want to do those edges as well. When all of your edges are zigzagged or overlocked, we're going to sew the side seams together. That is the side seams of the skirt and of the facing, and then we'll iron them open. When your side seams are sewn together, we'll iron them open. And so on the skirt and on the facing. And I'm also going to take this opportunity to iron my hem and the edge of my overlap. So I will iron, I'll fold once at 2 centimeters and I'll fold again at 2 centimeters. And I'll just iron that down on the front edge and on the hem. Now that all of the seams are ironed open and folded, I will attach my facing. And I want to make sure when I attach my facing that I attach it with the seam allowance of the facing inwards towards the seam allowance of the skirt, because otherwise there's no real point with a facing, right? So when I pin it together, I pin right sides together, skirt and facing. And I match up my side seams and I pin my seam allowance open. You also have notches on the facing matching up with the darts and the center back and center front of your skirt. And remember also that your facing doesn't have seam allowance on the front edge, so it's shorter than your skirt. So don't panic. It's supposed to be that way. And we do that to hide the raw edge of the facing. So just pin your facing up to the crease line of the fold that we ironed before on the front. Now I will attach my facing with a straight stitch, just 1 centimeter seam allowance. Then when I'm done, I will iron that seam open and do an understitch on the inside. I want to make sure when I sew my facing that I don't sew the fold of the front skirt, like that I attach it to the facing so it's locked in its fold, because I'm going to sew that fold separately in a different way. So I'll just leave it open here. Iron that seam allowance open and over to the facing, and then we'll do an understitch right next to the seam on the side of the facing. Now that my facing is understitched, I will iron that flat like so. This is the outside of my skirt and this is the inside. But before I do that, this is the top corner of my skirt. This is the seam allowance of my front fold over edge. And what I will do now, see if I can make it a little clearer. So facing, seam allowance, I have 4 centimeters here. You might have 4 centimeters or 2 centimeters. And this is my bodice or body skirt. My skirt body is what I'm trying to say. I will now fold in, if I have 4 centimeters, I will fold in 2 centimeters underneath. And then I will fold all of that over so that it lies on top of my facing, like so. And then I will stitch that down just 1 millimeter over on the facing side. Either you can stitch it down right in the fold as well, like a stitch in the ditch right there. But you can also just stitch it down a little bit further down on the facing if you're scared of not hitting your seam exactly with the stitch in the ditch. If you're kind of like unsure and you don't want to risk sewing on the body of the skirt, then just sew a little bit over on the facing. So I'll do that now on both of my sides. And now, when I fold that over, this is what it looks like. So this is the outside of my skirt, and on the inside, I have no raw edge here. And what you can do now, so what you want to do, first of all, is you want to just cut that corner off. Like, you don't have to cut in your facing. Just fold your facing away and cut that little excess off there. And you can also, if you have, like I have a fabric that frays so much, I will just cut those threads off right there, just so it's not visible. And then I will fold it over, make my corner a little pointy there. And this is what it looks like now on the inside. So I have no raw edge of my facing because it's hidden in my seam allowance. And I also have no raw edge on top, and it's a nice clean finish. After that, we'll continue with doing this corner. So since I have, so either your corner looks like this, right? You have your 2 centimeter seam allowance, and then you have your overlocked edge there. Or your corner looks like mine, where you have 4 centimeter seam allowance, and it looks like this. So this is the inside of the skirt. What I'll do now is I'll put a pin where the top edge folds over to the front edge. And then I'll put a pin on the bottom as well, so right where they meet. And then I'll also put a little pin here where the corner is. Then I'll fold it up. So I have my pins in. I'll fold it up, but I'll leave my, if I have 4 centimeter seam allowance, I'll just leave my 2 centimeter on the inside. And I will put the pins together, just aligning them perfectly there. Like so. And then I'll find where I had my pin on the inside. So my pin on the inside is right here. So that is where my pin on the inside is. And I know that that is my peak of my corner. So I'll just hold my fingers there, take that pin out. Well, actually, I'll just put a pin on top of it. So I know that, okay, that's where I want to sew to. I'll take the pin out that is underneath. Okay, and this is what it looks like. Now, I will sew from my corner pin here to my 2 pins on the side. Just a straight stitch. I'll start right here, making sure that it will go straight to these pins. Take my pins out, cut my thread. Oh, my light went out, hang on. So, before I cut anything, I will just fold it over to verify that my corner is good in the place where I want it to be. So this is what it looks like. That is a perfect corner to me. I think that looks great. And I can now cut my seam allowance. So I'll just fold it back out. I'll cut this off and cut it open here to the seam so that I can iron all of the seam. That's actually too much. I'll cut a little bit more off. There we go. And then I can iron that open. Just fold it over to show you guys. That is what it looks like. That's on the inside, and on the outside it looks like this. So I'll do that on the other side as well, and then I will press all of that. I'll just iron it flat, and then I can continue with sewing my hem and my borders. Okay, now we will sew the hem and the side of the skirt, the front edge, that is, not the side seam, because we've already done that. Okay, so I will just align my fabric. I'm not gonna pin it because I've already pressed it and it's gonna hold its place. If you want to, you can pin this, obviously. So I'm going to align my fabric with the 2 centimeter edge here on my machine, and I'll just stitch it like that. A very important thing to remember if you're kind of like a beginner at sewing is when you do a hem, or if you just sew at the edge, if you do a hem, it's more relating to hems. If you do a hem, you want to make sure that you don't align your presser foot with the inside fold of your fabric like this. You want to align your measurement lines on your machine with the edge of your fabric. Because if you're like me and you just fold your hem like by eye, I never measure my hems and fold. Sometimes I do, but most of the time I just go like bam, bam, bam. That looks like 1 centimeter, 2 centimeters, whatever. And then I sew it. But of course there's going to be some discrepancies in that measuring because it's all done by eye. So if I were to align it with my inside edge here, my outside seam would not be straight at 2 centimeters or 1 centimeter from the edge. So you always want to make sure that you align your fabric, the edge of your fabric, with the measurements on your machine to make sure that you have a straight seam at the hem from exactly the same measurement from your edge and not from here, because then you might end up with a seam like this, you know. I mean, maybe that's the look you're going for, or you don't really care, then that's fine, but it just gives a cleaner finish. And that is my hem done. I think that looks very nice. Now, before I sew my buttons on, I will just attach my facing to make sure that it doesn't move. I'm going to do a stitch in the ditch right here. So on my side seams, I'll just do a stitch down here right in the seam to attach my facing on the inside. I will also do it where I have my darts to give a little extra reinforcement. So I'll just pin it down on the inside and then I'll sew it from the outside. Make sure that your seam allowance is pinned open so you don't get any bulkiness there. Make sure that I stitch right in my previous seam because I don't want this to be visible. I'll just do a couple of stitches there, just back and forth, nothing like remarkable. We have arrived at the final step of the skirt, which is buttons and buttonholes. And since I couldn't really mark out my button positions before, or there wasn't any point in me doing it before because they would have just gotten erased. So I'm going to do it now. I'm going to take my pattern, put it on top, and then just mark out where I should put my buttons and my buttonholes. And then I'm going to hold it up against my body, try it on, like wrap it and pin it, just to make sure that the buttons are in the right position where they have to be for it to fit me. Because this is a wrap skirt, so you can kind of alter it where you need to put your buttons for it to be a good fit on you. So I recommend just trying it on quickly before you actually sew your buttonholes on your buttons. But yeah, otherwise that's the final step. So I'm gonna do that now, and yeah, that's it. Also, your button position depends on the size of your buttons. Like obviously if you're doing this skirt with massive buttons, say that you're using like 3 centimeter diameter buttons, then you're not gonna be able to put the second button so close to the top button as it is on the pattern. So you just want to make sure that you adapt the button position to your preference, fit, and buttons. On the facing here where the buttons are, I also want to make sure that when I sew my buttons on, I sew it only in the facing. I only attach the button to the facing and not to the outside of the skirt. Because first of all, if you attach it to the outside of the skirt or the dart in general, it might be visible, the stitching, And it will also, if the skirt is a little tight, like say that you have a really big meal, you know, and the skirt is a little bit tight going home, then it's gonna pull. It's gonna pull on the fabric on the outside of the skirt, and you don't want that. So if you just attach the button to the facing of the fabric, it's gonna pull on the facing, but not on the outside fabric of the skirt. The buttonholes go on the two edges, so on the wrap over, so on the overlap skirt edge and on the underlap skirt edge, that's where the buttonhole goes. And then the button goes on the inside layer. And I will sew my buttonholes horizontally because it gives a little bit more ease and movement to the wearer, because the button can kind of move horizontally with breathing and moving. Whereas if I do vertical buttonholes, then the button can't move. It's not flexible. So I will do horizontal buttonholes on my skirt. Okay, so my buttons, or my button positions, are all set. I have pinned them in place. I'm just gonna try the skirt on real quick off camera, of course, to make sure that the buttons are in the right positions of where I want them. And then I will make sure, I will also just verify how much lower I need to put my second button in order to not be too close to my top button. And then I will sew it on.